So welcome one and all to episode 6 of the Bright Green Debates. It is fantastic to have you with us watching. As always, we are live on Facebook at 7:30 p.m. every other Tuesday, and also on Zoom. And we will also be broadcasting, as always, back on YouTube if you want to watch it again. So I'm going to do a few bits of introduction, and then we'll get started with our debate for this evening. So the first thing to say is just apologies that we're running a few minutes late. I say we go live at 7:30. It's normally about 7:35-ish. So in future, if you want to make a cup of tea at 7:30, you probably won't miss anything. But we are live now. My name is Chris, and I am the editor of Bright Green, and I'm going to be hosting the debate this evening. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to the event. So the Bright Green Debates are a series of conversations we're having with prominent figures from across social movements, from across the left, from trade unions, from the media, to discuss the biggest issues of the day. And we have a great list of questions all submitted from our audience that we're going to be tackling this evening. A couple of bits of housekeeping for those of you who are on Zoom. Please do keep yourself on mute. It means that we won't get any background noise, and it also means that you won't accidentally get broadcast across the internet and your face appear or your name. So keep yourself on mute. It will keep everything running smoothly. For those watching on Facebook, as always, please do hit that share button. If you've enjoyed these debates so far, people that you know will also be enjoying them, will also get a lot out of them. So hit that share button, make sure your friends see this stream, and make sure that we get more people watching. We had over 100 people watching last week. I think we can beat that this week, but the only way that we can do it is if you hit that share button right now and make sure more people see it. It doesn't cost you a penny, so hit that share button. Also, if you're watching back on YouTube, of course, hit subscribe. It means that you'll never miss one of our videos, never miss one of these debates, and make sure that you keep up to date with everything that we're doing. And then the final thing just to say is, as always, you can tweet along on the hashtag BrightGreenDebates. So that's it from me in terms of housekeeping. It's now time for me to introduce our fantastic panel. I'm incredibly excited to hear all of the things they have to say. So we have 3 wonderful panelists this evening. First up, we have Rachael Maskell. Rachael, do you want to give us a little wave? That's Rachael there. So Rachael is a Labour MP, and she's a Shadow Minister for Charities and a member of the Socialist Campaign Group. Cleo Lake is a councillor in Bristol, the former Lord Mayor of Bristol, who ran in the Green Party's deputy leadership election last year, coming second. And finally, we have Asad Rehman, who is the Director of War on Want. So that is our panel for this evening. I am going to very, very briefly stop talking and move us on to our first question. So we have 4 questions this evening covering some of the biggest topics, the biggest issues that are taking place in the world today. And the first one we have is on the major story that's been filling up broadcast hours and column inches this week. And it's on the Tory sleaze scandal. So the question is, how do we ensure the Tories aren't allowed to get away with the sleaze scandal unscathed? And I'm going to come over to Rachael on this one first.
Thanks. It's a really great question, because obviously it's running in the headlines today, but what about tomorrow? And we've got to remember that this has been in the making for over a decade of them being in power, and it's built the environments in which this current sleaze can take place. And it's every day there's another revelation about either the misuse of public money, private money, as we've had today, or indeed power. And I think if we look at money and power, of course, who have they taken it from? And they've taken it from you, the public, and then being able to use it for their own benefit. I think there's 2 kind of politicians: people that are there to profit themselves, and those people which are there to serve. And I think there is a real distinction that needs to be drawn about the value base of our political system. First of all, we need stronger accountability, of course, and there's big questions about whether or not ministerial codes have now been broken, and clearly Nolan principles as well. They're the rules that govern us as politicians to make sure that we act with propriety in public life, which is absolutely vital. But on top of that, we've got to look at how politics has changed so radically, I'd say, since the current Prime Minister came into office. And I think we saw very much there a misappropriation of power as well. I would say that we've seen that over the last 11 years, but in particular since he took office. And I think where the risks come, of course, with this whole agenda is that what does this actually deliver as well for our country? And of course, we're in a very precarious situation. We've just had Brexit. What is has been deeply damaging to our economy. We've obviously going through a pandemic, and we need to make sure there is high levels of scrutiny, high levels of accountability, and high levels of honesty. And we're not seeing any of that. And therefore, it's about the system being able to hold politicians to check. And it's not robust enough at the moment. Now, obviously, some of this is now being pushed into select committees, which means that the Prime Minister, his other ministers are going to be held to account. And I think that's really important on many of the issues. But you think of the things that we've seen just in the last year, the PPE contracts that were signed, test and trace, which didn't deliver. Then, of course, the health secretary withholding from a court case, even after a court case, withholding those contracts with private companies. And this is why Labour has got to be really confident at saying nationalisation is good, because it then puts everything in the public domain and people can be held accountable. And then, of course, then we have Greensill, text messages, money changing hand, decisions being changed, and that whole area needing to be looked at. Of course, at the same time, we're seeing eye-watering sums going in one direction, charities, on the other hand, which by the Lobbying Act were completely curtailed, of course, not getting any money at all, and they're almost being starved out of existence. And of course, with the police crime sentencing and courts bill being told you can't protest, can't speak. And now there's the big debate, obviously, over the Charity Commission, which was politicised by Tina Stowell's appointment. She's moving on. But what about the future of that body as well, where charities themselves very much curbed, not even being political, but investigated? And therefore, we're seeing this real misuse of power at the same time. So it's touching all parts of life. So when asking about being sustained, what we have to do in politics, I believe, is keep telling stories. Stories mean a lot to us. This is your money, this is your power, and we have got to keep showing how that is being taken not just for granted, but taken away from you, which then means we can't change all the other fault lines within the system. So I'll start with that. I may want to come back, but that's certainly what I see at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to move over to Cleo now. So obviously in the last few weeks, we've seen a huge number of allegations and revelations regarding Tory sleaze. But this, as Rachel has pointed out, has been going on for throughout the whole of the pandemic, at least in terms of the cronyism, in terms of alleged corruption. How do you think that we can make sure the Tories don't get away with this unscathed?
Well, I hope there can be an element of reining in by using the mechanisms that are available, as mentioned by Rachel. But I think at the same time, can we ensure is perhaps more of a question. Not how, but can we? Because I think a lot of people are getting to the point where actually it seems that a vast wave of people are immune now, or just not bothered, have become so used to seeing this in the media and hearing about it, this massive abuse of power. It's sadly slowly becoming the norm. How do we expect young people, or anyone really, to do the right thing in life when, as our taxi driver would say, we're led with the least among us, we're led by the least amongst us? And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. We really are. There is no integrity. There are no morals. And I think as a politician, it's really important to see how we can reach out to huge numbers of people from various demographics, actually, who continue to support and vote Conservative, even when actually it doesn't serve them. What kind of brainwashing has been going on? Yes, there is a freedom of choice in this country, but surely there's something that needs to be reprogrammed and restarted amongst many sections in our society. So how we do that is probably more of the question. How do we reach these people? How do we get to them from where they are? I think that's really, really important. We do need political reform and electoral reform. It's about how do we plot and plan and work to get the Conservatives out, and hope, actually, that we do have a tangible difference with whatever party comes in afterwards. I think so much is up in the air now in British politics that we also have to think, do we perhaps need a different kind of system altogether? What other models are there out there in the world? Do political parties really work? What's going on? So these are just some bigger questions, really, but I'm not convinced. Fine, we might see a bit of a push and a shove from some of the backbenchers, perhaps, or whatever, but I got a feeling that we're not going to see Boris budging for now. And that's really, 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 really depressing.
Thanks, Cleo. So, Asad, I wanted to bring you in now, and I wanted to pick up actually a little bit on something that Rachel mentioned. So, obviously, you work in, I guess, in the charity sector, and the kind of hoops that charities have to jump through to get access to funding, particularly government funding, but also other funding streams, is huge. And yet, it seems at the moment we're in a situation where, if you're a private business, all you need is a former prime minister lobbying on your behalf to get access to contracts, or to run a pub that Matt Hancock is a patron of. What do you make of this I guess this sleaze scandal, the cronyism scandal, and how it's affecting our politics?
Well, thank you, Chris. I suppose my first point would be, if we were talking, if the media was talking about any country in the global south, it wouldn't be using the word sleaze, it'd be using the word corruption, right? We would be talking about politicians, former prime ministers using their contacts for their own benefit. I mean, it's estimated that, for example, the former Prime Minister David Cameron would have benefited maybe up to 22 million if Greensill hadn't collapsed, using insider knowledge. We would have been talking about how, you know, regimes were prioritizing access for their friends, for business interests, for powerful interests, who were then making policies that benefited them. And we saw with Greensill, they were given a desk in the civil servant. He had a business card which was a advisor to at number 10. They not only researched policy but devised policy and then won the contract for that policy. So really we're talking about, I think, a much deeper issue. And you know, charities for a long time have campaigned on this. We talked about, for many years ago, about lobbying transparency, about the importance of ensuring that we have genuine democracy, where we have genuine accountability. And, you know, the limited steps that were made on lobbying transparency, for example, you know, were very, very limited. They were not what the civil society were calling for. We were calling for an end to the revolving door between civil servants and private business. We were talking for cooling off periods for politicians. We were saying every meeting needed to be minuted and it needed to be made public, so we know not only who was meeting who, but what were they discussing. At the moment now, if you look at the information that the government provides, they simply say we met X person and we talked about trade investment. You have no idea what policy they were lobbying to change, what companies they represent. Out of the 4,000 lobbyists that we estimate are lobbying Parliament and decision makers, only about 300 are actually registered. So I think there is a much deeper issue going on in terms of the democratic deficit that exists between citizens and the state, and whether the state and democracy response to the needs of people. And I'm not going to repeat all of the examples that Rachel made. I mean, I think, you know, this litany of step after step of, we saw the scandal in terms of the PPE equipment, of the test and trace, that diminishes people's both engagement and trust in the political process, and that's hugely damaging. So I would like to see, not only in terms of course, politicians having to be held accountable for these individual actions, whether it's, you know, whether it is the Prime Minister and, you know, spending tens and tens of thousands on redecorating his flat, or the former Prime Minister David Cameron, or previously Tony Blair lobbying on behalf of foreign governments in terms of the UK. All of those things are, I think, absolutely critical and important. But I think there needs to be a much bigger conversation, which is, how do you reset the relationship between ordinary people and corridors of power and decision makers? And I think we need to be talking again about, a new vision of democracy, thinking about the constitutional arrangement. All of these things are just examples. We could have talked, for example, about the royal family influencing parliamentary bills. At every stage, it seems to be that the powerful are able to shape policies to benefit them. And we know what the result of that has been, of course: record levels of inequality, more and more people feeling outside of even the democratic space, less and less engagement, less and less trust with politicians. And that is really, really damaging, both in terms of our democracy, but also of what it actually means in wider politics. I think the rise of, for example, right-wing populism that we're seeing all around the world is a direct consequence of decades of what I would call of politicians who said only the market can make the right decision. Only business people have the power to devise right policy. And we saw that clearly with Greensill, right? It was very much this idea, even if people weren't individually benefiting, like former permanent secretaries, there was still this idea that, people in the banking sector knew more, right? They should have more privileged access, where civil society, which acts as a balance with the eyes and ears of ordinary people, are often locked out. And as Rachel said, are facing increasing restrictions on our ability to be able to engage in the political process. Restrictions on the ability to be able to campaign, very, very clear warnings that were given to many charities not to engage in the last election, not to raise issues. Most charities took that as a strong warning to sit out the election. We saw very, I think, misguided advice given to charities about engaging in the Brexit referendum. All of these things diminish our ability to be able to have ultimately good decision making and decisions that work for ordinary people.
Thank you, Asad, for that. I'm going to pause there in case Cleo or Rachel want to come back in on any of what's been discussed on this question. And whilst I wait to see if there's a little blue hand appearing, I just wanted, for those of you who are watching on Facebook, there's a few more of you joining the stream now. If you've been enjoying this conversation so far, please do hit that share button and make sure that more people can watch the stream, because if you're enjoying it, they will be enjoying it too. And of course, if you are watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. It means you will never miss a single one of these debates. I can see that Rachel wants to jump back in now, so I'm going to go over to Rachel.
Obviously, what we've seen has been deeply shocking, but probably not unexpected. But I think we've got to bear this in mind. This is what we know in the public arena to date. And of course, we don't mix in these circles which these lobbyists are moving in. We're locked out of these networks because they've been built, let's not forget, back in the days when they're at school together and then have been through the system together. So it's very hard to disaggregate these informal networks which have been built up, which is really where these deals are being done and the powers are being built and the contacts are being made. And therefore, it is a case that we are going to have to go root and branch through our system to shine a spotlight on what's happening in these relationships, which ultimately then are delivering issues like changes in policy, the lobbying which goes on. I mean, as a constituency MP, I find the amount of people that are contacting me, they just want to tell you this or that. I mean, I have to say, I just walk away from it because there's no point engaging. And, if I want to find out information, I will go and seek that out. And of course, we've got great charities out there to resource us and support us and really value that base. But these kind of wheels within wheels, that's why we think there's far more to come out. But of course, where the scandal really starts building is the interests in which government pursue, the issues which they then follow through on, and the result that comes from that. And we think about really important things you know, things like the climate. Why are we not making the advances that we should on those kind of issues? It's because, you know, we've got heavy lobbying from the petrochemical industries and others, which are saying, actually, my interests need to come first. So we have to understand that whole of politics is skewed because of these informal, often, discussions which are going on. So whilst Cameron may be up there at the moment and Johnson and his dealings, I think there's a much darker, more sinister picture, which we're just not seeing. And we have got to get into that stuff to really understand why politics is in such a bad place.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. I'm going to move us on to our second question because we have 3 questions still to get through and an hour left together. Our next question is on a different topic, but equally, if not more important. It comes in the news as of last week of the former policeman Derek Chauvin being convicted for the murder of George Floyd. And our question this evening is, what impact will Derek Chauvin's conviction have on the Black Lives Matter movement? And I'm going to bring Cleo in first on this one.
Well, obviously, it was such an important conviction, but sadly, as some people had said, that we were almost, some of us, despite our backgrounds, were geared up for it not going the right way because we're so used to it. We're so used to getting injustice. So it was a very important moment, and I dread to think what would have happened globally should he not have been convicted. But the work continues. I mean, this is a 400-year plus journey, and this is a significant milestone on that journey. And I would like to think, actually, that the wave of Black Lives Matter, and without getting into some of the controversies about this and that, but the sense of the movement and what it stands for, which is about liberation, and is quite a youth-led movement to an extent, I would say. I would like that it connects with the reparations movement globally as well. I think that's a really important next step. And we've seen now in the US, the HR 40, finally, reparations legislation that was introduced at every session of Congress since 1989 is now being voted on at committee level. So there is some movement now, finally, some traction on that. And it's also happening here. As you know, reparations motions have been passed in Bristol, also Lambeth and Islington, and also at the Green Party conference. Reparations matters. I think it's also important to cross-reference that conviction happened just a day or 2 days before the anniversary of Stephen Lawrence Day, and the reflections against the Sewell report. In fact, you know, building those bridges really and making those reference points, cross-reference points, that institutional racism does exist in the US, does exist in the UK, and that's what we need to be tackling.
Thanks, Cleo. So I'm going to bring Asad in next on this one. So over to you, Asad.
Well, obviously, true justice would have been that George Floyd was still alive. That's true justice. True justice would have been that no Black person walks out of their home fearing that they're going to be killed at the hands of the police. True justice would have been Black families not having to teach their children, you know, all the different things about how to respond if a police officer comes, because of course, the experience, not just now, not just of the last 10 years, but as Cleo said, over generation after generation had been built into the Black community that no matter what you do, you stand, you get shot, you run, you get shot, you put your hands up, you get shot, you in your home, you get shot. So just during, you know, that Derek Chauvin trial, you know, 3 people were still being killed at the hands of the police each and every day, right? Over half of them were from the Black and Latino community. And what is interesting about Derek Chauvin's trial is, you know, of course, we're all absolutely grateful that there is some accountability, because that's what it was, just about an individual. But it's not accountability of the police, and it's not accountability of the criminal justice system. Because even listen to the police officers who gave evidence against Derek Chauvin. It was all about, you know, procedural. Oh, he put his wrong he put the wrong knee on the wrong part of the neck. Or if he hadn't kept it at 9 minutes and kept it at 7 minutes, everything would have been all right. No questioning actually of the question about, what was the intervention of the police? How was the police escalating these moments? How are the police criminalizing the Black community? And we know that of all of the deaths that have occurred in terms of the United States, I think there's been a total of like 19 convictions, right? And most of those convictions have been for, misdemeanors or for very, very short sentences, even when it's been murder or homicide. So in that sense, you could say it is a step forward, right? But, that took place because somebody filmed it. It took place because there was a movement that was built that took to the streets, that organized and mobilized and said, we want some justice. But that in itself isn't justice, as I said, because there's a much bigger conversation, right? I mean, 1 out of every 100 people in the United States is incarcerated, right? 1 out of every 5 people in the world who are in prisons are in the United States. There is a much bigger issue about the criminal justice system, but it's not just in the US. My background, I've been involved with many deaths in custody campaigns here in the UK, and I was involved with the Stephen Lawrence campaign. But here in the UK, since 1990, we've had about 1,700 deaths in custody, right? The last time a police officer was convicted of death of a death in custody was back in 1971. I worked with the family of Jean-Charles de Menezes, Ibrahim Say, Shiji Lapita. Countless families have faced this question of what they're going for, of course, is not justice. They want an end to the impunity that led to their loved one dying. They want some justice in the sense of some closure. But most of them also then say, I don't want this to occur to any other family. I don't want the suffering that we went through to happen to everybody else. And that requires a much deeper conversation around the criminal justice system and around the role policing plays within our community, and particularly in terms of minority communities and Black communities. And we mentioned earlier, the police bill, and I'm sure you've had lots of conversations about this already in previous things, about what the relationship of policing with consent and public order policing, the difference in terms of the kind of policing, the role that policing has also, to address the much deeper issues, right? Whether it's in the United States or here, about economic inequality, about the social deprivation, and the police's then role is to police that inequality, to police those injustices. And so we need to have a conversation about the criminal justice system, but we also need to have a much deeper conversation about the society we live in and we created both in the UK and the United States, which denies so many people the right to live with dignity. So when I look at the state and state violence, I don't just think about state violence in terms of those individual police officers. I also think the state violence is the people who are homeless, the people who are working dead-end jobs, for less than minimum wage, the people who are worried about feeding their families or heating their homes. All those things are forms of violence, and they affect both individuals and our community. And so we need to, again, have a much bigger conversation. Now, I'm hoping that the Black Lives Matter, it doesn't take away the impetus that people say, well, Derek Chauvin was found guilty. Isn't that really great? Everything's solved. Because of course it wasn't. It's a step forward, but we're in a very, very long journey before we can actually say we've really addressed the question about institutional racism inbuilt within our societies, and also racism that is baked into our systems at a global level. And we have to recognize that. I don't know if people saw the CNN Sartorium, the former Republican sort of senator, talking about American culture being white European culture, and and this epitome of like democracy and decency, and the Native Americans had no culture, etc. But there is a mindset also, a much bigger mindset, and it's why I said about sleaze and corruption, that there's a question about when these things happen in the global north, they're termed in a very, very different way, where if they were happening in the global south, we'd be talking about systemic violence, we'd be talking about the UN needs to investigate, we'd be talking about human rights organizations saying, the state is failing its minorities or it's failing its people. We don't use that language when it comes to governments in the north. We don't use that language when it comes to those experiences. We individualize it. We talk about the individual police officer or the individual misconduct rather than actually talking about policing as a whole.
Thank you so much for that. And Rachel, I could see you nodding along to a lot of what Asad was saying then. So in terms of some of those points that were being made there around, I guess, overhauling the criminal justice system, what do you think of that as I guess a proposal in terms of one of many mechanisms through which we will need to address in order to kind of deliver racial justice, and how the Labour Party's policy positions sit in relation to that?
Thank you. And first of all, I would say if all we're after is justice, then we are never going to change society. We have got to be hungry for equality, and that has got to be our aim. Justice is just one of those markers on that journey to get to equality. And the starting point, I mean, obviously we've had the Seal report, and you know, this has so suppressed the conversation that we should be having, because we have got, our starting point is recognising the institutional racism which exists across all of our institutions in society. And unless we make that declaration, then how are we ever going to go on that journey and to go deeper into our organisations to understand the stem and the root causes of that, and then to bring the reparation and change? And that's what we've got to see. So I think what I've said is, often we're talking about a kind of a bar to hit or boxes to tick, and then that means fine. I don't believe that at all. I think we have to recognise the issue and then create the learning culture through which we can then bring about change. And that means about really rerouting the way that our kind of systems work in this country, because they're built on the colonialism of the past. The whole system itself was predicated on those systems of justice, and therefore there is no justice in reality. And that's why disproportionately, if we look within the criminal justice system, why are more Black people in prison? You know, it's clear there's an inbuilt prejudice within the system about access to justice, access to legal aid, not getting proper representation, going back further about obviously more exploitation, opportunities in the education system. So you can't just look at the justice system without looking at the whole system. And of course, all of this layered with mental health challenges that people experience in society and the way that they're supported or not supported. So just taking a step back from that and in looking at that journey we have to go on. One, we have to call it out and we have to recognise it. And I think what I think we all have to say is everybody holds within them the ability to learn more about the inequality that we see around us. And therefore, we have all got a role to play in that confessional place in order to then be able to move forward and to look at the institutions. Because if I look at Parliament, and I wanted to speak in a debate about the closure of Parliament to highlight why Parliament was continuing to sit, because it was the workers who were working in the canteens that were being drawn in, the cleaners that were being drawn in. They're the people that had to get the public transport and expose themselves to COVID-19 so that, you know, the powers that be could continue their meetings as opposed to going virtual. So, you know, at every single stage, that was an institutionally racist determination, I believed, in the way that that the system worked. And therefore, I think, you know, right across our system, we have to look. When I was a national officer at Unite, I looked at race in the NHS. 1% of leaders in the NHS at the time were from Black and minoritized communities. If we think 1% of leadership is, what's that going to say about your organisation? What's that going to say about the health system of which you are in charge of? What's that going to mean about the quality of care to achieve, to ensure that there isn't bias within that whole care system? And therefore, we have to look at issues of leadership. We have to look at what those barriers are. And it's a massive piece of work. And it starts with that place of recognition that we've got a problem. So what we need to make sure is that Black Lives Matter isn't a moment, but it is a movement. And it's a movement of consciousness that moves our society forward on this issue. And one of the things I certainly notice in my role looking at charities, we know there's a lot of Black and led charities. They're very local, they're doing fantastic work on the ground, but actually they're not in the seats of power. They don't have access to the seats of power. It's going back to what we were saying before. They're not in those circles, those organisations are. And therefore, how do they ever bring influence when we've all at the same time got a suppression that is coming around the rights of organisations to speak out and challenge? And of course, we're seeing the Tory MPs writing now about the Runnymede Trust and saying, you know, clearly, you know, it's stepping into politics and breaking through those barriers that it's not allowed. And of course, that's more suppression. That's a denial of what's happening. And this is why we've got a systemic problem right at the heart of politics, but also right in the heart of our institutional state. And we have got to keep pushing and pushing on those doors. And as we say across the trade union movement, it starts with education, it moves to activation, and then of course we've got to be organised, and that's the path we need to go on.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to bring Cleo and Asad back in on this question, and there's something that has kind of been picked up by a number of people, which is around this question of institutional racism in the UK, and obviously off the back of in the aftermath of Stephen Lawrence's murder, which I know that many of you have mentioned, we had the Macpherson report, which kind of introduced or at least acknowledged that there was institutional racism in the police force, and now we have the Sewell report released just a few weeks ago, as Rachel mentioned, which is essentially denying entirely the existence of institutional racism in the UK. And I guess the question I wanted to put to you first, Cleo, and then I'll bring in Asad as well, is obviously in the last 18 months, we've seen the kind of huge growth in the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, which has kind of in many ways moved on into the Kill the Bill movement, and has previously been in relation to the reparations movement, as Cleo mentioned, and so on. And yet we have a government which is in many ways moving us far, far back in terms of the path of racial justice. So I guess the question that I wanted to put to you really was, how do we continue to build and strengthen those movements that we've seen growing over the last 18 months, but also for many years prior to that? So I'll come to Cleo on that first, and then I'll come to Asad.
How do we continue to build these movements? Organising is really important. You know, people can get caught up in the moment of a protest, or you know, the exciting end sometimes for, you know, people who are, so for some people it's been their first journey into protest and activism. And I think that is notable. You know, I am in Bristol, and to see some of the young people go out, whether it was Black Lives Matter or the more recent hashtag Kill the Bill protests, it was very, very disturbing to witness on social media these young people who, you know, they've been in lockdown, they've got their own stresses. We know that mental health is a major issue amongst young people, particularly at this time through Covid. They're finding their way in the world, and they were met with police violence on the streets in Bristol. I mean, it was a shocking sight to see. And the image of a young woman who was hit, bashed to the floor by a riot shield is one that is hard to get out of my head, really, being a Bristolian and being anywhere. And I think it really speaks to the reality that needs to be faced. You know, nothing can be changed unless it's faced. And that is the elements that we need of systemic reform, institutional reform. Misogyny, racism, they go way, way back. They've got strong roots in this country and across Europe. You know, when my ancestors were being enslaved off the coast of Africa, women in Europe and the UK were also being burnt at the stake here. This was happening at the same time. These things are deep-seated and they need to be addressed. There is a historical aspect to it that is still now seeping out into society, the legacies of this. And it needs to be tackled. It can be tackled. I've been on, for example, the Avon Fire Authority since 2017, and I've chaired the Diversity, Inclusion, Cohesion and Equalities Committee. And in fact, when I arrived on that committee, it was probably about 24 mainly older white men who bickered amongst themselves. It was quite shocking to see as a new politician, actually, and the environment there. Luckily, fire service doesn't have some of the reputational issues or kind of community clashes, if you like, that police does. But it doesn't mean that the institution is perfect. And again, have worked really hard, for example, to recruit more female firefighters. I'm saying this because there were some really damning reports from Her Majesty's Inspectorate, but it was taken seriously and a significant work plan was put in place and a culture change journey. And it is a challenge. You will get most people on side, actually, on this culture change journey. There will be a few who won't be on side, but by and large, they have been. And I think that's a very good experience for me because I am standing for Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'm also committed that we need to have institutional reform. And also, sometimes great things do happen in institutions, actually. Journeys are being made, steps are being taken, but I seem to find this culture of keeping it quiet and doing things quietly. There's a place for that, but there's also a place about doing good work and shouting about it to give public confidence that you actually are going in a direction that a lot of people want to see in society, and giving that message to other people who perhaps aren't as far along the road. Education is key. Some people are only as good as the education they've had, and we know that the education system in this country has been lacking. So this is from an institutional perspective, but it does have a place in society, of course. It can inform how we interact between institutions and the public is important. How institutions can support community movements. Again, with reparations in Bristol, there is a community and institutional approach. It isn't just about passing a motion at a council, but it's about the groundwork that needs to happen in communities to keep the momentum and to spread the word. Sometimes it can be confined to a certain bubble, the work that's being done, but it's really important to educate and bring as many people along as possible. Obviously, a lot of people are getting burnt out and exhausted, exhausted of, in some ways, in inverted commas, being the ones who are having a lot of the harm meted out to them, but also being the ones expected to educate and inform and solve all the issues. That can't happen. So there is a massive place for everyone to step up, every person of consciousness to step up now. And as a side note as well, but an important note, there was the unveiling of a memorial just this Sunday gone in Windrush Square, Brixton, for Cherry Gross, who was a mother shot by a Metropolitan Police officer who raided her home looking for someone, wrongly shot. And there is now, and that sparked the 1985 Brixton uprisings. So again, we have these moments, these peaks of action, whether it be an uprising that's sustained over a number of days, or a protest, or some sort of social media hashtag campaign. But it's about how we build off the back of that and how people commit to building. So, again, in Bristol, I've supported young people to form their own assembly so that they can have a regular meeting where they can start to plan action and try to be self-determined in a world that tries to lead you down a road of dependency or complete disenfranchisement.
Thanks, Cleo. So I'm going to come back over to Asad now and hopefully pick up where Cleo left off there. So I guess, yeah, just to restate the question again, we have a government now which essentially is not only refusing to take action on institutional racism and the issues that we've been discussing, but actively has released a report that is denying it. So how do we sustain a movement that can take that on in the face of that?
When you've been around maybe as long as I have, you this all feels like deja vu, right? I mean, for the Black community, all the way through the 70s and 80s, 90s, you know, facing countless murders. That was exactly the position of the state. The state denied the scale and the level of racist violence. The state denied that there was a problem about racism within the police force. And we've got to remember, whilst the Macpherson inquiry and Macpherson report, you know, recognised institutional racism, that was a 20-year campaign led by Black organisations. Right before Stephen was killed, we had Roland Adams and Roy Dugal all killed within weeks in the same area. We were burying, you know, an average of at least 10 people each and every year. I mean, the amount of places up and down this country in the 80s and 90s, we used to travel to support families, and the same experience again and again from both the local state and the national state. And it took sustained organizing, right? Not just individual protests, but sustained organizing. And I think one of the lessons for this moment, looking back, is, you know, what we created was an ecology of Black-led community organizations, right? From the monitoring organizations to the advice centers to the infrastructure that enabled the community to be able to hold the state accountable at all of its levels. And that was deliberately destroyed. If you look back in terms of what Margaret Thatcher talked about, she talks about, you know, that radical Black-led organizations are a threat. We had the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in the 90s saying that, you know, anti-racist groups like New Monitoring Project were the most sinister, damaging organizations in operation. And we know now, of course, there's a spy cops inquiry taking place at this very moment that the state spied on, you know, both individual families fighting for justice, for the anti-racist organization, and of course, much broader, the labor movement and other campaigners. And that was done deliberately to destroy a lot of that infrastructure, so that all we've ever been left with at a local level are largely service providers. And so there's a gap in terms of everything is about down to the individual, rather than there is an ability to be able for people to be able to organize collectively, demonstrate their power, because as an individual to the state, that's an unequal power balance, right? And the only thing that's ever balanced it is when we've built collective power. That's true in the trade union movement for workers' rights. It's true in terms of the fight for gender equality, on every single level. That's one universal truth that spans the whole of humanity, right, for centuries. So I think this moment we're in, there's some important lessons for us. Representation is important, but we always used to say, you know, it's not about just having some black or brown face in the room. The question is, who do they represent? Who are they accountable to? And we saw that with the Sewell report, right? You can predetermine and set a number of people to reach the outcome that you want, and then have them say, well, but I'm also black and brown. There was a saying in our community, you know, there are people who are skin folk, but not kinfolk, right? And we've always had that, right? There's always been this question about accountability and who you represent, and about ensuring that the genuine voices of the community are heard in the corridors of power. I hope that this moment will lead not just to more protests, but actually to a re-emergence of those kind of progressive, radical community organizations that are rooted in local communities, serving their local community in terms of having that, understanding the intersectionality between people's issues, that you don't want to go to the state because actually you're fearful of your immigration status, you're worried about your precarity of your job, all of those things. We know that the complexity of people feeling disempowered by the state is so intense for so many people, not just black people, but large sections of white working class communities as well as the black working class. There is a real importance for us, I would to bring back that race, class, gender analysis, right? To avoid this argument that's been created deliberately, which is to create a culture war between white working class and black working class, as if the fight against racism is not also the fight in terms around white working class solidarity. We had this fight. We had it at Grunwick strike, and we had it at Imperial typewriter strike, right? When large parts of what was then the traditional labor movement said organizing of black workers was undermining, wages, wasn't something that was threatening jobs, etc. And that had to be won, right? We had to win the argument So much so that by the time the Grunwick strike happened, you had tens of thousands of Yorkshire miners coming down to support the Grunwick strike. And just as a personal anecdote, I grew up in the 1980s. My first big industrial strike that I was ever a part of was the miners' strike. And let me tell you, that was, you know, a decade after the Grunwick strike. But in my community, people were supporting the miners in the mosque, temples, and gurdwaras, because people said, we remember that the miners came down and supported our workers at Grunwick, right? Because that was not just a strike in terms of at a factory, it was a community struggle. And I think what we've got to do is rebuild this politics of what community politics is. You know, how do you build a really cohesive and powerful community and build a community voice? And that's where I think we're at this moment at the you know, we've had large-scale protests, but we've not got an infrastructure and ecology that holds that. You know, we've got traditional, what I would call more mainstream civil society organizations. You know, I mean, a lot of them do great work, but they are largely often white and middle class. They often are also quite divorced from their communities. We've seen the deliberate, you know, erasure and destruction of, you know, advice centers, of law centers, of all the things that were critical to people's fight for power and fight for justice. And so part of, I think, at this moment is, again, we need to rebuild those. If we really want to create that kind of anti-racist society that we're all committed to, that doesn't happen just by whatever a government report or even some proclamations by political leaders. You have to do hard, solid graft. And that was what we'd done for decades to get to a point where, I have to tell you, where, you know, I live in East London. For years, in Newham, there were large parts of this area we would not walk in. They were no-go areas. The reason we've changed that was not because of, you know, what a politician said. It's because we were on the streets, winning hearts and minds, driving out the far right, taking on racist ideas, building in terms of tenants association, building community organization. That's a really hard slog. We've got to sort of look back and not just eulogize our political icons of black radicalism, you know, of Claudia Jones and Olive Morris. We have to learn what they did, and what they did was build organizations, and that's really, really important. And I'm glad Rachel is here, because I think part of what, you know, for any vibrant society, we know you need a vibrant civil society, and vibrant civil societies aren't just about big charities. They're actually all the way through. They're about community organizations. They're about the small tenants association, because all of those things are the infrastructure in which people can be able to realize their power. Now, the one amazing thing I think has happened both with Black Lives Matter, etc., is that for many, many young people who feel so alienated from the political process, they felt a sense of collective power when they were out on the streets. And that, you know, thinking back to 1994 and the Criminal Justice Bill campaign then, you know, one of the, I suppose, if there is an upside of this police bill, is that, you know, these all-encompassing bills which try and tackle and target everybody from the right to protest to Roma and Gypsy communities and traveller communities to stop and search, have got an ability for us to build a much more broader, bigger coalition of together. And that, if you look, that in 1994 was the foundation of so many powerful social movements in this country. It politicized a generation of young people. It led to many people who then a decade later were involved in anti-war stuff, in student politics, and added to, you know, our democracy, right? Created people who had an understanding of both their individual power and their collective power. And I think we're at this moment where either we're going to have whole generations of people feel totally disalienated and turn away from all democratic institutions as they are, or we're going to see a re-emergence and a revival of that democratic spirit which says the state is ours, power is ours. We shape the state to reflect our needs, to meet our concerns and meet our demands. And when we're in a moment of multiple crises, from climate inequality to COVID to recession to these injustices from racism and patriarchy, now is the time for us, I think, to be much bolder, to have a much bolder vision, not just about instrumental dealing with each thing, but actually having a much bigger conversation. What is this country? What is the kind of society we want? How do we build fairness and equity and justice in it? So I'm supremely optimistic, because I've always been optimistic in the ability of people to transform politics, and I think that's where we are at this moment.
Thank you so much for that, Asad. I can see Rachel wants to come back in, so
Yeah.
I'll just let you in briefly.
I know we're only halfway through the questions, but I very much do want to come back after what has been said. And just to be brief, we have to rebuild the politics in so many different ways. And, you know, this is why I talked about organising, because that is absolutely at the root, but also how we do our politics. And that means our political system has to change. And of course, looking at these new models of deliberative democracy, the citizens' assemblies and so on, it's the opportunity of bringing different segments of our society together in unity to go deeper into the debate than we've been. But we've got to also recognise the walls are being built higher before us, and we have to take those walls down. There is no other way around it, I'm afraid. And as a colleague of mine says, we've always had to fight for everything we have ever had. If you're, you know, white working class, black working class, you have had to fight for every single right. Nothing is ever given to you. But if you go arm in arm, there is a chance you could win. But if you stay at home, you never will. And therefore, we have to mobilise and get out there and protest and make some noise and cause some disturbance. Yes, that's part of it. But also we need to have those processes in place to outsmart these players. And if we think at this time, you know, we've got a Home Office that is, you know, got the hostile environment right embedded within it. And we can see that from every single policy which is coming from out there. We have to dismantle what those institutions are. And that's why doing democracy in a different way and actually learning to say no. It's a very powerful word, but we have got to learn to say no. And it's so easy to be complicit with the system in so many different ways, but actually we have to stand our ground and do things in different ways. And as we've seen with things like Extinction Rebellion as well, you know, the fact that the Home Office is coming after these individuals, they're coming after civil society, they will not rest, because they have got a completely different understanding about their power and the way that they can assert that. We have to stand strong and we have to stand united across our communities. And it is built on the ground, and it is built through relationships that are built over time, but also we can have renewed relationships in order to take things forward. I've seen some of the most powerful political acts, not in Westminster. And quite frankly, as somebody that used to go there, not at the moment, you know, it is a complete farce the way that Parliament works. You know, you have debates, nobody listens, you ask questions, they don't get answered. Ministers come and they're not accountable. As much as we scrutinise them and push them, we need to shift the whole power system in our country to get a new democracy, get proper voices back in the heart of our system. And that's why I want to see, you know, if I was to say one thing that would make a difference, one thing would be to shift the power and the resources back to the people, away from the centre, because that is the only way we can break some of the power which is being exercised over us. But I'll stop there because I know you want to move on to 2 more questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Yep, as you say, we have 25 minutes left and we have 2 huge questions still to tackle. So I'm going to encourage our panelists to be slightly pithier in their responses moving forward. Before we move on to our next question, just wanted to say for those watching on Facebook, if you've been enjoying this conversation, I know that I've seen lots of you have been watching right since the beginning and have watched for over an hour now. So if you've enjoyed this, people you know will enjoy this conversation too. So hit that share button and make sure that more people see this conversation, see this debate. because it will make the world of difference if you click that share button. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe, share the video, let us know what you think down in the comments below. So we're going to move on to our third question now, and it segues quite nicely on from what Rachel was just talking about there in relation to democracy, because next week we have a democratic exercise taking place with an unprecedented set of local elections, and the question I'm going to put to our panel next is, should Keir Starmer resign as leader of the Labour Party if Labour loses seats in those elections? And I'm going to come to Rachel first on this one.
I think in politics there's far too much focus on individuals and this kind of presidential approach to politics as opposed to looking at the what. So the who, of course, is important because it is about providing that leadership, but it's the what which is really matters. Is there an agenda out there which is going to bring about the solutions we need to the inequality, to the climate injustice, to the depths of poverty that we're experiencing, to challenge the power and to reshape our services and ultimately things that we've just been discussing, our justice system? If those policies in place, then as a society, have we got somebody to lead us who has the capacity to really be engaging the communities that matter across our country to bring about that shift in change? You know, I should think in the local elections and the elections we're just about to have, every party are going to lose seats and every party are going to gain seats. That normally is the pattern of things. There is a shift in different places in different ways because politics is complicated and people's decision making is predicated on all sorts of different things. But as we move forward, I think what we have got to see is the rescoping of our political system. So I think the key things we need to see is the agenda that comes forward in the next few months, because we have got COP26 this year, we've got the G7 this year. These are really crucial times where we are meant to be on this global stage, but have we got the policies in place which are going to make a difference to our communities? I live in a community which floods. You know, climate is encroaching on us. And it's flooding more and more frequently. These are going to be crucial meetings. But also, I think what we have to, as internationalists, think, who are the leaders which are going to build the relationships we need to transform the rest of the world, so that we can build these new alliances which can really make a difference about levelling up the inequality that we're seeing. And of course, we've got gross inequality everywhere, every single strata of our society, but across the world as well. And I think we have to think more globally in the way that we act in politics, because we've got a very interconnected world. Business thinks globally, but somehow we seem to be imploding in on ourselves at the moment, becoming very self-interest. So I'm not that interested. I know I'm a politician representing the Labour and Co-op parties, but I'm not that interested in the internal factionalization of politics. I'm more interested in the external, building a society which is going to be transformative. And I think that's where we have to put our focus. Now, if Keir Starmer rises to that bar, fantastic. And we've all got to get behind him and help him get there, because, you know, being a leader of a party, I have to say, it's a pretty thankless task and it is very challenging. But if there is somebody else who has got the talents and skills that can do that, they should be rightfully leader of the Labour Party. And the reality is it's chosen on a democratic process. But I think, you know, one of the things I think we certainly did see under Jeremy Corbyn was, you know, the fact that the leadership was tested on a regular basis. And as a result of that, you know, we saw how people actually supported the work that he was doing and the policies he was putting forward, you know, and obviously never got that opportunity to see that fantastic manifesto of 2017 and 2019 being put into place. But we've got to build on that. And of course, where we can build strong political alliances, we absolutely should. You know, I think politics has become far too tribal. You know, what is the colour of your rosette? Puts these big barriers between us. And actually, if we're bigger about it, we need to recognise what the common threats are at the moment. And I have to say, the most far-right governments that we could ever imagine, far worse than in the days of Thatcher, the way that this despicable government is acting. And we have got to join together to fight that in order to even get a look in order to take power back out to the country. So there's a massive task ahead of us. We could be facing a general election in 2 years, and I trust that all parties will want to work together to achieve that aim of building a more just society.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm going to come over to Cleo on this one next. So Labour are somewhere around, in some polls, double digits behind the Tories. And the Greens are kind of muddling along around 4, 5, 6%. What do you think the kind of outcome of these local elections is going to be? And do you think that if Labour does underperform, that they need new leadership?
Well, a lot of issues there, and I think just to follow on from Rachel, with the enormity of some of the challenges that face us, it is about how we do find cohesion and work together. And tribal aspects of politics, I think, are a threat quite often, but not least because of the habitual voting habits and tendencies of many people who vote. There is a lot of I'm based in Bristol and, Southwest, and there is a lot of disillusionment at the moment. We can't deny that. So, people's attitudes towards the Labour leader are quite vocal, I would say. And it is the complete opposite to what we saw in Bristol in 2016 election. And, the local election then, when there was a kind of Corbyn fever, which, although it shouldn't make a difference to our local elections, it did sway a lot of Green voters, and it was a massive talking point on the doorsteps. That's the complete opposite this time. The vibe is not the same as it was in 2016, and there's a lot of disillusioned Labour voters who are moving to Greens, or certainly are questioning their loyalty to Labour. So it is an issue that needs to be looked at. Even to the extent as well of selecting candidates. That seems to have been happening quite late on for Labour, and actually candidates being selected and then deselected because they've been critical. So that's quite worrying, and I am very appreciative that I am a Green Party councillor and candidate and member, because we're not, in inverted commas, and I hate the word, whipped. We are allowed to challenge, we are allowed to have our own view. That isn't the case for some of our other colleagues, and I think that is a very unhealthy environment. We've actually had a Labour councillor move over to Greens. I don't think it's, I agree with Rachel, I don't think it's right to solely blame Keir Starmer for everything. But at the same time, we can't just, what I'm trying to say is we can't just blame the leader, the overall leader, for some of the things that are happening on a local level, because things that are happening on a local level quite often under a Labour administration are also, not popular at the moment. And that can't just be pinned on the national leader. But we do have to recognise the difficulty of the times we're in, with, the backdrop of austerity and cuts to budgets which are going to get worse, Covid, Brexit, climate emergency, mitigating that. There are a whole host of factors at play. But the disillusionment is there. Very hard to call, really, how Bristol will be voting. But I, of course, I would say I hope it will be more Greens, because I do see Greens as doers. But again, it is about how we have cohesion, how we work together. One of the positives from the last year has been the collaboration between the Deputy Mayor of Bristol and one of our Green councillors, who've come together to get the first Citizens' Assembly off the ground. That sense of active democracy, that's positive. And going back to the reparations motion, also cross-party. So there are great ways that we have and can work together, and that does need to continue with the next administration and council that gets voted in, regardless of what the political colours are. The only people we don't usually get cohesion with at times is the Conservatives.
Thanks, Cleo. So both Cleo and Rachel there have talked about progressives working together from across party, and obviously Asad, in your position, you I guess can't be party political about these things, but what are the things that you want to see political parties advocating for in these upcoming elections?
So you're absolutely right. We don't get involved in the internal politics of Labour, although we are the Labour movement's charity. I think there is a much bigger question in terms of about these local elections. I mean, first of all, we're going to see shockingly low levels of engagement, right? And that's been true of local elections for a number of years, and that speaks to the fact that local democracy or local authorities have been stripped of power. So there's a broader agenda in terms of, the decentralized agenda of handing back power to local authorities. So people, when they are electing their elected representatives, know that they actually can make a difference in their lives. Absolutely right. We're living at a time where we've got a broken economy. We've had a decade of austerity. We've got record levels of inequality, poverty. We face huge challenges in terms of the climate crisis. If the UK was doing its fair share, we would be aiming for a decarbonising by 2030. For me, the question more is, are we able to put forward, and are people putting forward a progressive vision that can enthuse people? Because a progressive vision is key to no matter which party, because what you need is an opposition party that can hold the governing party to account. And that isn't just simply about at the dispatch box or in Parliament. It's actually about having a vision that engages people, that you're building power and you're building connections. And so what I would look for at this moment is something that was much more profound than what is being offered, right? I mean, I think nothing that political parties are offering in the sense of meets the actual challenges that we face, right? I mean, the IPCC on climate has told that the world has to decarbonize by 2050. That means rich countries like the UK has to decarbonize by 2030. That means it's not a technical thing in terms of, oh, well, that just means switching away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We actually have to have a much bigger conversation about what is our economy for? What is sustainable energy? What is productive energy? What kind of work do we want to have? What is the new economy we want to build? We already know millions of people. I mean, around the world, 300 million people have lost their jobs already because of the COVID pandemic and recession. It's predicted hundreds of millions more will lose their job. We know that the climate crisis is compounding that. We know that it's the same here in the UK. We know that increasing numbers of people are in precarious work, are barely struggling to survive. And the answer seems to be more deregulation of the labour economy, more people working in the gig economy, more people basically struggling to just get by. And this is an opportunity for us to I think, to have a much bigger conversation, right? What do we value in terms of work? And it's said, of course, during COVID, many of us, many people suddenly realized that actually the important things in society are our frontline workers, not just in terms of NHS, but public service. It's the people who who are valued the least economically in our society, who are actually the most critical people. How are we having a conversation that switches from this kind of broken economy to, when we talk about a care economy, it's actually a value-based economy. It's about what are we investing in? What kind of jobs do we want to be able to create? How do we rebuild our communities? I would want that to be a rich conversation. Instead of this conversation, Richard, I think, as Rachel said, it ends up being quite presidential about, individual figures, right? Because the individual figures don't represent. It's not about Tweedledee or Tweedledum or tweet or thinking these are all pale variations of each other. I think there needs to be somebody stepping up and actually telling the truth about how broken our economy and society is, and putting forward a vision that actually can fix it, and then engaging people and enthusing people. People every day practice politics in their lives. And the idea that people aren't political, people are deeply political. The question is, are they party political in the sense, do they feel that politics of being voting or being involved in political parties makes a difference? And if they feel it doesn't, then people are going to disengage with that process and look elsewhere. And I think this, for me, is I mean, let's look at how many people vote, but I think we're going to be shocked about how few people are out there voting. I think either people will sit on their hands or people will just say, you know, it doesn't really make a difference who you have. And I think that's really bad for democracy.
Thank you for that, Asad. So we have just 10 minutes left, and we've got one final question to squeeze in. And I'm sorry to our panel because it is an absolutely huge question, but we have very little time to cover it. Apologies for my timekeeping. So I'm going to ask our panelists, if possible, to keep their responses to under 3 minutes on this one so that we can finish up on time. So this comes in the context of what we've seen in the last week in particular of huge rises in transmissions of COVID, particularly in India. And we're seeing hospitals in India becoming overwhelmed. And the question this evening is, how should the UK be supporting the fight against the spread of COVID in India? And I'm going to come to Asad on this one first.
Well, it said that the COVID pandemic exposed every existing inequality and injustice within our societies and between our societies. And if we look over the last year, what did we see? We saw rich countries compete with poor countries for PPE equipment. We saw poor countries saying, you know, we need urgent financial assistance because our public health systems have been deliberately destroyed by the policies of the global north with trade systems, forced privatizations, etc. We saw rich countries turning their back on them. And then, of course, we've seen vaccine apartheid, right? In terms of 14% of the world's population in the global north, amassing over 50% of the vaccines. But at the core of it, actually, the story is the story of this world, right? Which is actually when governments say nobody is safe until everyone's safe, what they really mean is actually we're quite happy to sacrifice the poorest people in the world for profit. And we see this with pharmaceutical hold on the vaccines, right? Majority of the vaccines have been funded by public funds in terms of the research. And that's been true, not just of COVID vaccine, but historically of every single major vaccine that's been put on the market. In the US, it's estimated that close to nearly a trillion has been given sorry, 900 billion has been given in public money by the federal government for vaccine research, and yet then that research is handed over to pharmaceutical companies. So there's one question about the vaccine, about equitable access. There's another question about breaking the power of the pharmaceutical companies. The UK, you know, it's two-faced in this sense because it's talking about how concerned it is about India and it's going to send 24 ventilators. At the same time, at the WTO, it's blocking the TRIPS waivers, which would allow equitable access in terms of the vaccines. We see already, you know, even in terms of there is huge capacity in the global south to be able to produce these vaccines. They're being prevented. The materials that they need, they're being prevented because there's embargoes by the rich countries who are saying we want to prioritize vaccinating our own citizens. But even if the global north shared the existing vaccines, 70% of the world would be vaccinated in 2021. Instead, we're going to see most of the global south not vaccinated to 2023, 2024. And already the big drug companies are already saying they're going to massively ramp up the price of their vaccines. Pfizer, for example, on its call recently with its shareholders, talked about how vaccine is going to give it a huge bump. It's already made 4 billion in profit. It's talking about the vaccine increasing from $19.50 to up to $150 to $170. They're waiting for the pandemic to be declared over in the global north so that they can exploit the global south. And this again is not new. It happened with AIDS. It happened with access in terms of vaccines. So there's a much bigger conversation about the right to health, making health a universal right. It was said in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a global NHS should be, it's possible. We have enough, we have the technology, we have the wealth, we have all of those things to put in place. That'd be one thing. And I think we can't also separate that what's happening in India, there is a link between what's happening in India, what's happening in Brazil, what happened in the US and other countries, which is about these far-right populist governments who basically put the interests of the corporations and their economies ahead of their citizens. And I think hopefully at the end of, I mean, it's tragic. I know many people, of course, in the Indian subcontinent. My family originally from the Indian subcontinent. the stories that we're hearing on social media, for example, of people desperately asking for oxygen, remember, those are the elites, right? Those are middle-class people who've got access to social media. Often those pictures that we're seeing are of the private hospitals. In the public hospitals, it's even worse. The dead literally will not just be buried or but cremated, but they will never ever know how many people actually died as a result of this COVID pandemic. And that fundamentally is about the broken economic system that we have, about the global injustice that we've created and hardwired into our economies and our societies. So fixing India's vaccine problem, this COVID pandemic, requires more than just sending over a shitload of incubators or gifting people some of our surplus vaccines. Actually, it's a much more systemic issue that needs to be resolved, not just for now, but of course for the future.
Thank you so much, Asad. I'm going to bring in Cleo next, because I know, Cleo, you need to dash off pretty promptly. So I'll bring in you next to this one, and then give Rachel the last word.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's, systemic ongoing issues that we're seeing play out here. It's obviously a tragedy. And again, it's profit over people with an onset of panic as well. And I think so many of these things are preventable. Poverty can be eradicated, but it's the will to do it by those who are in a position to that is lacking. And we're seeing this over and over again. And I think the response so far from the UK has actually been really appalling. I think they've only really given equipment over in the last few hours. That is totally insufficient as a response by one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So this vaccine apartheid as well has to end.
Thank you, Cleo. And then finally, Rachel on this one.
There's so many things I could say about kind of the global inequality that we've seen. And I've been asking so many questions in the House of Commons about just the ability of other places to be able to manufacture the vaccine. That really is the way that it breaks through, because it's so short-sighted of our government, because the longer, of course, where there's risk around the globe, then there's more opportunity for mutations to then come back into the UK. So, this is going to be a vicious circle that could be endangering people in this country as well as across the globe. When we look to India, what we know is that the infrastructure isn't there, which could address the issues. What the images we're seeing, of course, are people that have access to hospitals. So many people will not even get that far and will die in their communities because they just have not got the healthcare system that obviously we're privileged to have in this country, but the fact that we are privileged to have it in this country says a lot about what is wrong within our global systems, because we have built that privilege on the back of the countries which don't have a healthcare system. So we have got to go back. It takes us back into issues about racial diversity and the inequality that we're seeing, but on a global scale. And if we are going to rebuild our systems, of course, in this post-pandemic era, and we've been talking so much about wanting a different kind of country, we have got to talk about a different systems in our world. And this is why the G7 conference coming up in a couple of months is just so vital, because we can't keep going on this trajectory where the West continues to exploit other nations at its own benefits. So this comes back into talking about what's the infrastructure, the global infrastructure we need in order to not just address climate and pandemics, but actually the gross inequality. Because one thing we know, if we look at kind of what sparks obviously conflict and famine, the roots are always the same. It's the fact that some people are exploiting others because they've got the power to do that. With regards to obviously the immediate crisis within India, I mean, I would say that every single life matters, no matter where it is in the world. And we have got to move heaven and earth to give India, but also those countries we're not seeing on our screen. I woke up this morning to hear about what's happened in Iraq, oxygen exploding in intensive care, a horrific situation there, and as I say, there's so many countries which we just do not know what the situation is. And I suspect, there's some real tragedy to come to light in the months and years ahead. And we've got to see ourselves as a real international player. And of course, it's good that we've that investment was made in the vaccine. No one's going to deny that. But of course, what we do with that, and of course, if it's more vulnerable groups, which are going to be more susceptible to dying of COVID, well, why haven't we ensured that those groups globally have been vaccinated first, as opposed to everybody here in the UK? It's a really difficult decision to make, but we've got more vaccines than we need, so, far more vaccines than anyone's going to use. And I should think some of that will go to waste unless we really start giving that to the people that need it in those places where the risks are even higher. With regards to oxygen, we nearly ran out of oxygen in some of our NHS hospitals. We didn't have the supplies in place because a government decided to go down a path of austerity. Of course, many countries haven't had the equipment and the support that they needed in the first place. And unless we start sharing things out, we've got another pandemic on its way. We don't know when, we don't know from where, but if we do not build that global infrastructure, again, everybody is being put at risk, and we've got to value every single life equally, and that currently isn't happening. And that's why June is going to be an absolutely critical month to ensure that we start those proper conversations about the kind of world we live in.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. So I've had a request from Asad to come in for 10 seconds at the end. So I'll give you 10 seconds now, Asad, just for...
Well, just Cleo reminded me, even on the reparations argument, we talk about India and charity, right? During British Raj, the UK looted 45 trillion from India alone, right? And the reality, of course, is if we see COVID as a curtain raiser to the climate crisis, it shows how broken our global response is. And when people say, and politicians say, Black Lives Matter, actually they don't matter if they're in the global south. The poor lives don't matter. So it is critical, and it is our responsibility in the UK. We're hosting the G7 and the COP26. It's the moment for us to build, as Warren want, we're working on a radical global Green New Deal of how do you tackle the crisis of inequality, climate, COVID pandemic, and historical injustices. And I think that kind of agenda that connects our issues and finds the right solutions, because often the solutions to one crisis are exactly the same solutions right across the board.
Thank you so much for that, Asad, and thank you to all of our guests and our panel this evening. Apologies that we have run over a little bit. That is all that we've got time for tonight. Of course, we could have spoken for many, many more hours on these questions and many more. But once again, a huge thank you to our panel. And of course, a huge thank you to all of you for watching. For those of you who've been watching on Zoom, those, of course, who are still watching on Facebook, hit that share button right now. People can still watch. It will get more people to see it. If you've enjoyed this conversation, people will enjoy it too. Just a few final things to say from me before we leave. The first is that if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, comment down below, let us know what you think, and share the video. It will get more eyeballs on this conversation and mean that more people will hear from our incredible panel. The next thing just to say is that you can find all of our upcoming debates on our website, bright-green.org. So if you're interested in coming along to one of our future debates and watching it, you can find out who our panelists are on there. Next up, in 2 weeks' time, on May the 11th, we have a fantastic panel already booked. We have the Labour MP, Clive Lewis, the Green Party member of the House of Lords, Natalie Bennett, a Green Party member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, Rachel Woods, and we have Kat Hobbs joining us from We Own It. We'll be discussing a huge number of things, including the Queen's speech, which will be happening on that day. So we'll have lots to discuss from that. The final thing I just wanted to say is that this event and all of our events like it are only possible because of the kind donations we have from people like you. If you are able to donate, if you want to see more events like this, if you want to fund independent progressive media, please head to bright-green.org/donate and help make more conversations and debates like this happen. That's it from me for tonight. Thank you once again to our incredible panel. Thank you all for watching, and I'll let you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evenings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Bye, everyone.